you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And this, in my opinion, both biblically and empirically, I think is where the war is today. I told you that the war on the gospel is typically one of two things, either a war on Jesus, which is constantly raging, or a war on sin. I think we are in a war on sin. And here, let me explain. Paul will tell us this in chapter 6 when we get to that in a couple of months. And he'll say, I need you to stand firm and be aware of the schemes of the devil, chapter 6, verse 11. And let me tell you what the schemes of the devil are when it comes to sin. First, he wants to minimize the consequences of sin. Second, he wants to reorganize the standard of sin. And third, he wants to criminalize the very idea itself. Let me explain. First, he wants to minimize the consequences of sin because that's what the devil has always done. Remember Genesis chapter 3? The serpent's more crafty than any of the animals which the Lord God has made. And the serpent comes to the woman and said, did God really say you couldn't eat from any tree? Well, no, it's just that one, or even touch it and we'll die. Oh, he didn't mean that. He's holding out on you. He's lying to you. You're not going to die. In fact, your eyes will be opened. You see, the devil has always, and he always plays the same chess move because the devil is not so much creative as he is persistent. He applies the same things over that we see in the garden, and he wants to minimize the consequences of sin. Sin will not make you dead. Don't be so dramatic. Minimize the consequences. Second, reorganize the standard. How do we know what sin is? We compare it to the character of God, the holiness and righteousness of God. And Satan says, no. Just compare yourself to someone else. Are you better than them? Are you in the middle of the bell curve? Because at the end of time, don't you know, it's really just the weigh scale. Like, are your good deeds better than your bad deeds? Really, in comparison to everybody else. Finally, it's this move towards, just really compare you to you. What do you like? What are your passions? I tell you, it's made it all the way down to the street level in 3 words that I think are among the more dangerous words in our culture today. 3 words. Live your truth. You see, that is reorganizing the standard. There is no capital T truth. That's the standard of God, his character, his holiness and righteousness. It's all the way down to my truth and your truth, and they can have no similarities, and it's just fine. I'm living mine, you live yours. That is a scheme of the devil. Minimizes the consequences, reorganizes the standard. Finally, he criminalizes the very idea of sin. And popular culture, the only and the greatest sin is to actually identify something as sin, isn't it? That's the most intolerant thing that we can do. To call something sinful, to call something outside of the boundaries of the will of God, the character of God, his holiness and righteousness. And when we do that, all of the other tolerant people in the culture become quickly intolerant of our crime. And our crime is to identify sin. And that's the scheme of the devil. Minimize the consequences, reorganize the standard, criminalize the very idea. How dare you say what I am doing is wrong? This is what's happening also in the so-called progressive Christianity movement. All of the same schemes are alive and well there. It makes me think of Hans Christian Andersen, this 200-and-something-year-old writer of children's stories. He wrote things that you may not know that he wrote, like The Little Mermaid. Right next to The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen, 1837, he published a story that you're probably familiar with. It was originally titled The Emperor's New Clothes, translated into over 100 languages. The simple story is this, and I want you to emulate the unnamed hero of that simple story. Here's the story. We had a rich, extravagant, and very selfish and vain emperor. Two swindlers come into town that say, we will, for a very large sum of money, make you the most splendid, magnificent clothes you have ever seen. In fact, we have a process that's so amazing that the fabric and silk that we weave are only visible to the most wise. If anyone is unfit for their role or unusually stupid, that's the phrase Anderson uses, okay? Unfit for their role or unusually stupid, they can't even see the fabric. And he says, well, I have to have this fabric. Gives them a large sum of money. And the swindlers go on their loom weaving nothing. And everyone in the city knows the story, that if you're unfit for your role or unusually stupid, you can't see it. And so everyone plays along, and he puts on, they mimic and mime putting on all this stuff and tying it around, and guys behind him are even carrying his imaginary train, and he's walking through the middle of town with nothing but his underclothes on until one child, the hero of the story, unnamed child, yells out, but he has nothing on. And his father says, can you believe the impotence of children? And the child says again, but he has nothing on. And that's the story. I want you in our culture, in this war on sin, to mimic the bravery of that unnamed hero of the emperor's new clothes. Tell the truth, especially when it's not welcomed. We must tell the truth. And the truth is that there is such a thing as sin. And the standard is the character of God. And the wages of sin are death. That's the truth. We must speak it out. Because that's where the gospel begins. The gospel doesn't begin with you're bad and you need to get better. The gospel begins where Paul begins. And we'll get back to the text. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins.